I wonder what keeps you up at night. Maybe you're somebody who has raging anxiety. It could be that you're on a particular medication, or maybe, like me, you're just at a stage of life where your kids keep you up at night. My wife and I have arrived at a point where we don't say good night at the end of the night, we actually just say good luck because it feels like a full night's rest is purely down to luck. But it is true that we come to these occasions in our lives from time to time, or maybe more often for some of us, where we find ourselves having sleepless nights caused by a job that's gone wrong, or caused by children who have grown up and now they're out of control and we're concerned for them, so we can't sleep. Or maybe it's purely that our family relationships are on the rocks. Psalm 4 is describing a situation like that. David is in the midst of facing criticism from people, slander and lies, and so he reflects on that situation. If you're joining us today, welcome as we journey through the Psalms. We're going to be looking at them one a week for roughly 3 years. So thank you for joining us. Today we are at Psalm 4. Psalm 4, it says in verse 2, "O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies?" And so David is facing slander and opposition. And like Psalm 3, this is a psalm of lament. So what is the situation of Psalm 4? Well, it seems like David has been spoken poorly of. He is, after all, a politician of sorts. And as an Australian, I know that politicians are an easy target for slander, and that seems to be what's happening for David here. But what's interesting is David's response to this slander. Partially, he turns to God in prayer. He also turns to the ones who are speaking against him, and he asserts himself as one who can rebuke this kind of talk. He says in verse 3, "Know that the Lord has set apart his faithful servant for himself." Now he's referring to himself in that. He's saying the Lord has set apart the king to be a holy representative amongst the Israelites. The king was meant to be a godly person who was an example to the rest of the Israelites and somebody who could potentially call out the Israelites when they were doing the wrong thing. And that's what David does here. He calls out these people because he sees their false speech and their shameful behavior and he thinks it is wrong. And so in verse 4 and 5, he gives them 6 commands. He calls them out for their sin, and it's something that we can reflect on. Firstly, he says, tremble. This is like an encouragement to be afraid. He's saying, remember that God is just, and justice has a way of working itself out when you're with God. And so that might work its way out immediately, or it could take a long time, but justice will arrive. So tremble when you're doing the wrong thing. Secondly, he says, do not sin. Pretty straightforward. Third, he says, ponder in your own hearts on your bed. Now, David knows that for many of us, lying in bed is the moment where we have pause and an opportunity to reflect. And so ponder in your own hearts. He says, be silent and to reflect. And then he says, offer right sacrifices, which for the Israelite people meant going through the sacrificial system to seek reconciliation with God and with their neighbor. And then he says finally, and probably cumulatively, above all of those other things, put your trust in the Lord. These lament psalms, they often arrive at this: put your trust in the Lord. Things are going wrong around you, but don't lose your trust in the Lord. And then to conclude, David tells us that despite all that he has faced, he's found a successful sleeping pill for him. Verse 8, in peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. David's sleeping pill is that he trusts in God's safety. Now, when he says in this verse, in peace I will both lie down and sleep, you're meant to get the idea that those two things are happening together. So what he's really saying is, as soon as my head hits the pillow, I'm asleep. Doesn't that sound lovely? Wouldn't that be a wonderful experience? How does David manage to fall asleep so quickly? Well, it seems that rather than focusing on the trouble in his life, he focused on the safety that he has in God. For you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. This is like what he said in Psalm 3 about God being his shield and his glory. It's like what was said in Psalm 2 about the way that we are blessed when we take refuge in God. It's like what it said in Psalm 1 about the Lord watching over the way of the righteous. Now, all of this, you get this picture that what we should do is put our trust in God, see that we are safe in him, take refuge in him. But it does pose a question, doesn't it? It poses the question, does this mean that all who trust in God will sleep well, and all who lie awake for hours are failing to trust in God? Well, I think what is helpful to reflect on that question is to jump forward to the ultimate faithful king, the ultimate Messiah, the figure that David is pointing to Jesus, and to see how sleep functions in his life. Just 2 episodes from his life. Firstly, Jesus in the boat with his disciples. There is a storm raging around them. The wind is violent and the rain is loud. The disciples are afraid that they are going to die in that situation. And they are not unaccustomed to being on the water, but they're terrified. And Jesus, he lies asleep on a pillow. Even in that violent, dangerous situation, Jesus rests securely in God's care. So it's a picture of what David is describing here in Psalm 4. But I also want you to realize that that's not how it always was for Jesus. Because if we skip to a different episode in his life, when he is in the Garden of Gethsemane, you actually get the opposite picture. The disciples are now asleep, and Jesus is sleepless, and he's in anguish. He's wrestling with God's will for him. He prays 3 times through the night, "Take this cup from me." He knows that he's about to go to the cross. He says, "Take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done." And so it seems like you have these 2 opposing pictures, but they're actually not opposed, because in Gethsemane, God is still seeking to trust God. Jesus' sleeplessness wasn't from a lack of trust, it was from a struggle to trust. And that's ultimately what the heart of Psalm 4 is about. It could be that our sleeplessness is revealing that we don't actually trust in God. And so we are invited by Psalm 4 to examine our hearts as we lie awake in bed. That's what it says. Examine your heart. Is this why you're failing to sleep? But it could be that at other times we experience the distress and the anxiousness that are just a part of life in exile. And that might cause us to have sleepless nights sometimes, like Jesus did. And like Jesus did, we should wrestle to trust in God in those situations nonetheless. So, what keeps you up at night? Let me pray. Lord, in our sleepless nights, help us to trust in you. When worries arise, remind us that you care for us. Give us peace like David and strength like Jesus to rest in you, because in you we dwell in safety. Amen.